the Cold War. What a strange name. Neither cold, nor really even a war, at least between the two big superpowers. We all know why it was cold. It wasn't anti-global warming or some other kind of climactic issue. We all know that we were giving each other, the cold shoulder. And when we study this incredible story, the story of literally the end of the world, I want you all to kind of realize that's what we're talking about. We are talking about the end of the world, the end of all life on planet Earth. There was even by about the 1970s, once it became a reality, once the fate of the Earth, books like this were written about what would happen in a nuclear war. There were even situations where children could have diagnosis, psychoses about fear of the end of the planet. So how did we get to this point? Why did we build so many nuclear bombs? You would think after Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would be it. That after concentration camps and V1 and V2 rockets, that the world would turn around and say, we can't ever do this! And yet not only did we do it, we built so many nuclear missiles, so many nuclear bombs that by the heart of the Cold War, the United States could destroy the planet 8 or 9 times. Which of course makes you wonder, why would you need to destroy the world even once? So, in our class, of course, we were playing all kinds of games, doing reenactments, Civil War, American Revolution. We didn't want to recreate World War II for a lot of good reasons, and now you would say, why would we ever recreate this? I'm not really recreating the Cold War. Instead, I decided to make it a game. That we would have done in class, of course. And we would have made this a game in the battle of the sexes. You see, my interest, maybe just personally, is, if women had been in charge, would we still have done this? Was this all a testosteronic kind of nightmare in which men brought us to the brink? And so over the years in classes, I've had the girls play one team and the boys play another. Parallel universes, if you will. To see if the girls could have done a better job. Well, so far my research is still inconclusive. You can have your various guesses, but as I tell you this story, I want you to think of the story in that kind of an idea. I want to present it to you. What would you have done if you had been in charge, if you had been the President of the United States of America at really the most critical time in planet Earth's history? Just think about that. The most critical time in planet Earth's history. I would have given you various options. Let me show you real quick. You would have been able to choose all these different diplomatic, military options. You could have even gone to nuclear war. I would have then calculated various odds of you getting what you want, getting thrown out of office in disgrace, of even a nuclear war, and then of course we would have rolled the dice. Would you have destroyed the planet? Would you have made it like it is now, or would you have found some solution on it? That's the game that we would have played, and kind of think about that as we go forward here. So, you ready? Ready to play really the most dangerous game there is, the nuclear war game. To start, we have to review some of the results of World War II. We have to recognize that near the very end of the war, at the Yalta Conference, that the big three had decided to split Europe in half, right down Germany, right through the middle, that they were going to have an occupation zone with the Americans, the British and the French on one side of Germany, the Russians on the other, and Berlin itself, hence the t-shirt, Berlin itself, separated as well. If you don't understand Berlin, you understand nothing. Wait till you hear John F. Kennedy say that. Berlin is the epicenter of the entire planet, which is so weird, of course, because Berlin just a few years before, is where they designed the death camps, is where they planned the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the bombing of Britain, the conquest of Europe and beyond. And now Berlin's the most important city ever? Well, in order to understand that, you have to realize the location of Berlin. That Berlin is inside East Germany. It's like an island surrounded by communist sharks. Kind of weird, of course. The analogy I like to use is, imagine if Topeka, Kansas were a communist city controlled by the Castro family. Keep that in mind as we go forward in time. So you must understand Berlin. So, I want you to absolutely positively realize what this and this and this all have in common. In other words, go back, the creation of the Nuremberg war crimes trials. The same thing in Japan and Tokyo, putting the bad guys on trial. The beginning of the Marshall Plan, of the rebuilding of Europe and Asia, so that capitalism and freedom would be protected. And finally, the creation of the UN with the headquarters in New York City, with a Security Council, with permanent members of Russia, France, China, England, and the United States. In other words, a world army that could enforce the morality determined at Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials, they set a standard, a moral standard, that the UN would attempt to enforce. The idea that we all had natural human rights, remember, written by Eleanor Roosevelt herself. The human rights of all people on planet Earth. Notice our flag. A flag that many soldiers around the planet still wear on their helmets. So this is a whole new age. This is the age of a planet-wide government, perhaps? Not very efficient in a lot of different ways, based on a lot of different freedoms. It reminds me a lot of the Articles of Confederation, in fact, the way the UN would be set up. You never had to go to war, unless you really wanted to. So, keep this in mind, because as an American, I have to tell you that this is really one of our greatest moments. We had liberated the concentration camps. We had freed the Filipinos and the Chinese and so many other peoples who had been under Nazi or fascist yoke around the planet. We had put these people on trial. We had even carried out their executions. We had made a statement to the world that there is a certain behavior that is unacceptable, planet-wide, regardless of your sovereignty. You couldn't just round up a group of people and do whatever you wanted to them. We determined that that was the case because we, the United States of America, were the prosecutors in these trials. And we, of course, led the charge for the UN with the headquarters in New York itself, the World Court in Geneva. So there was some amount of sharing of the wealth, somewhat. So this, again, is America's greatest moment, and many times I think of those people who wear the Make America Great Again hats as they are thinking in some ways about this time when America was at the pinnacle, politically, of course, economically, which we'll talk about later on, militarily, at least close to the Soviets, as we'll see in that as well, but really this was an America we all could look up to and admire in every way, and everybody did. That's how you would have begun this game. You would have begun this game at the top, deciding how you would carry forth these American ideals, which we told the world were the way we all should behave. It was American ideals that went in Nuremberg, not, as Hermann Goering liked to say, that the winners just beating the losers. This was American ideals. As Judge Jackson himself even said, it was superior morality that won World War II, not superior might. So let's go forward. We even were ready to share the wealth, the knowledge. We had opened up Pandora's box the great knowledge of nuclear nightmare, nuclear technology, nuclear benefits like radiation treatments for cancer, nuclear energy for power plants. We realized that this incredible discovery could also be not only a nightmare, but it could also be something positive. And what very few Americans know is that we wanted to share it with the world. We wanted to tell our fellow members of the planet, here's how to do it. This was the moment when everything that we're about to discuss could have been avoided. When nuclear nightmares could have been a thing of fiction instead of fact. We offered to give everybody the technology. We said we must not be a slave of fear. We must elect world peace, not world destruction. What was the hang-up then? Well, the hang-up, of course, was that if we're going to give you technology, then, we just want to make sure that you're not building some nuclear weapon with it, like what might be going on in Iran right now. So, part of the plan was to have inspectors. Here's the stuff, here's the knowledge, you can do it. But we just want to be able to inspect your plants and make sure you're not building weapons with it. Well, guess who turned it down? Why would Stalin turn this down? Oh, you'll find out. There's a lot of reasons, but there's one very specific reason, which we'll talk about later on in this story. So, the nuclear weapons spread. This is a map from, let's say, the turn of the millennium, around 2000. At this moment in time, in 2000, all of these countries have either nuclear weapons or nuclear energy or the ability to make nuclear weapons. We call it nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons. What it has meant, of course, is that today we have a fear of these weapons, this technology getting into the wrong hands, like terrorists. We're afraid of smaller nuclear wars, for example, between perhaps India and Pakistan, which now both have nuclear weapons, of maybe some Middle East nightmare happening between Israel and Iran or something like that, of nuclear weapons, nuclear winters spreading all over the planet. Why did this all happen? Well, we'll find out. But first we have to deal with a bigger question, believe it or not. Or at least bigger as far as holy. What about the Jews? 6 million of them were killed in the Holocaust. If you had been playing this game, I would have asked you, what would you do? Would you sponsor the creation of the nation of Israel? We've talked before about how Israel is a focal point in the Middle East today, how many people love it, hate it, aren't sure what to think about it, that even terrorists, like we'll later learn about a group called the PLO, and of course Osama bin Laden himself will see the creation of Israel as a vile aberration that they're completely against, and they will attack all over the world, especially England and the United States, because of their hatred of Israel. And I would have asked you, would you create it? Well, Harry Truman, he thought that it was a no-brainer, that the promise made by the British back in 1917, the famous Balfour Declaration, this promise, I felt, should be kept, just as all promises made by responsible civilized governments should be kept. The United States of America, Harry Truman himself, felt that it was a moral obligation to create the nation of Israel. And it would look something like this. And so we sponsored the UN resolution for the creation of the nation of Israel. And as you can see over time, the green being areas occupied by Jews, the yellow being areas occupied by Palestinians, you'll notice the green grew over time because unfortunately many Arab nations, this is 1948 right here when it was actually first started, many Arab nations, many Arab peoples, especially the people of Palestinians themselves, had issues with any amount of land being given to the Jews. And so, unfortunately, in 1948, Israel fought not only its very, very first war for independence, but celebrated its birthday. Fought against Arab nations over and over and over again, like in the famous 1967 war. And today's issues that President Trump himself is dealing with right now, about is Jerusalem the capital? Is the West Bank an area that Israel should have or the Palestinians can have? So many, 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 many issues go back to the United States of America sponsoring these people. We let them out of the concentration camps. We felt, because remember what I said earlier, we were the moral superiority. We had judged the Nazis. It was our obligation to help the victims of the Nazis. We felt, Harry Truman felt, the buck stops here, Harry Truman felt, that we had to help these people. And so we created the State of Israel. And unfortunately, again, it was not a simple issue. And we made enemies because of this. Enemies which we're still dealing with to this very day. It's a complex issue. It's an issue, of course, steeped in deep history, biblical history. People from all over the planet, Jews, Muslims, Christians, all have different opinions on whose land this should be. And the United States is smack dab in the middle. So my next question for you would have been, your third scenario, would have been, in many ways, the best, easiest question ever. What do I mean by that? Well, I like to think of the Cold War as something I call communist whack-a-mole. That every time a communist popped up in some country around the planet, that the United States of America would lead the charge in whacking that mole back into the container. And we hadn't really decided if we were going to play this game yet, and then all of a sudden, right there in March 1947, a communist mole pops up in Greece. There had been a civil war going on. It looked like Greece might go communist, and the reason, of course, I say this was easy to decide is because, I mean, it's Greece. Greece. How can you say that democracy is better than communism when the place that gave democracy its name is communist? So for Harry Truman, this was a no-brainer. We can't let Greece go communist. And that's, of course, when he wrote his famous Truman Doctrine, saying that the United States should support free peoples throughout the world. He decided to play communist whack-a-mole. He decided to go up to that container, put in the quarter, and play the game. Not with American troops. But he gave money, gave aid to the Greeks. So it's kind of like he built a really big hammer and then handed it to the Greeks and said, here you go, knock those communists back in. A huge oversimplification. But what's so important to understand is that Harry Truman has decided to play the game, that he's made the Soviets the enemy. He's made communism the enemy. That's clear. This is, in many ways, a declaration of war. $400 million in aid to stop communism from spreading into Greece. And I would have asked you if you wanted to play that, if you wanted to let Greece go communist, what you would have done. We would have rolled the dice to find out if Greece had gone communist and what the implications of that would have been. That's how we would have played this game. Did Truman make the right decision? Most people, certainly the Greeks, and many, many, many others believe he did. So what you would have seen in the Cold War, and this is an incredibly, incredibly important understanding, not just for the Cold War, but to understand what's going on in the world with third world nations and terrorism and a war here and a war there, and why there's some kind of, terrorist Muslim Intifada kind of organization in Nigeria, for example. Why is there one there? What's going on in Angola today? What is going on? What you have to realize in order to understand everything in the world now is that it all starts here. At least a big chunk of it. You see, as we all know, the sun never set in the British Empire. The French had their empire. The Germans, the Italians, heck, even the Belgians had the Congo. But after World War II, they decided to let their people go. Not all at once. 1960, Niger, 1955, Sudan, 1973, Angola. 1947, India. You get the idea. And we'll talk what happens in Indochina and Vietnam another day. But they're letting these people go, but what will these people decide to be? Will they be communist or will they be capitalist? Will the people of Libya choose a capitalist government? Will the people of India choose communism, especially after everything that British capitalism has done to them? What will they choose? So that's why this was an ideological struggle. It was us versus them. The good guys in the white hats versus the bad guys in the red hats. And we made it simple. You're my friend or you're my enemy. You're with us or you're against us. And so both sides, Americans and communists, would look towards every single country in the world and decide, are these the good guys or are these the good guys? If you chose capitalism, if you chose freedom, if you chose democracy, you were our friend, and vice versa. And so what that meant is, if you were, I don't know, Saddam Hussein, and you said you didn't like the Russians, well, then you could be our friend. And he was for a while. If you were Manuel Noriega in Panama, going after, communist rebels, we might help you out. We had to make this simple. There was no other way to deal with it. It was the whole world. We couldn't go in and be judge, jury, and executioner for every single country, so we had to trust that these people would be good people. We'd give them money, we'd give them aid, we'd say go after the communists, every single country on the planet. That's what it had to be. And now what we're dealing with is all the repercussions of that. Oh my gosh, wow, Saddam Hussein was our friend for a while. We gave him some weapons. Look what he did with them. Oh my goodness. Wow, we better go get that Manuel Noriega guy in Panama. Oh my goodness. Once the Cold War, of course, was over. So you today are dealing with all of the issues of us making the world simple to try to win this war. As the British always like to say, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Well, now we've come to it. Now we're dealing with the repercussions of putting the world on two sides like that. And the most famous, I guess, dividing line of those two sides, here's the good guys, here's the bad guys, was of course made by Winston Churchill in his famous Iron Curtain speech. Yeah, an English guy, who was actually in the United States getting an honorary degree from the University of Missouri. From Stetson in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended on the continent. 1946, the war was barely over. On one side of this curtain were freedom and democracy, and on the other side of the curtain, who knew what was going on? It was an Iron Curtain. It was pretty clear that Churchill was saying, yeah, those guys are the bad guys. And so, this is what I mean by communist whack-a-mole. A man by the name of George Kennan decides, Mr. President, as your advisor, I have to tell you, we can't go to war with the Soviets. We can't go to war with the Russians. They got the biggest army on the planet. I mean, Napoleon and Hitler couldn't take them. And how many Americans would die in a war against the Soviets? So we've got to contain communism. So that's what I mean by communist whack-a-mole. It's like the game at Chuck E. Cheese, the whack-a-mole game. You know, you've got a big container, and inside the container are communists. And you can sometimes hear what the communists are doing, but you can't go in that container. Because if you go in that container, the whole place will explode. But every time one pops out, BAM! You knock them out. You knock them out yourself? Probably not. Probably you get someone else to knock them up. That goes back again to this. You give them the hammer. You build a big hammer. You give it to the guy. He knocks them out of the container. If you can understand this analogy and then apply it to basically every single country on the planet, then you can begin to understand all the various issues. What happened in Angola, in Vietnam, in Korea, on and on and on and on. So this was the way we decided to play the game. And then, of course, is Berlin. The t-shirt almost matches up, right? Shut the lights off one more time just to make sure you can see this. This is the city of Berlin. It's within East Germany, so East Germany is all around it. An island of freedom surrounded by communist sharks. Communist side, British side, American side, French side. And it's June of 1948. And Stalin has decided, and let's be a little bit fair to Stalin, not like he deserves it. Stalin has decided, this is just crazy. Look, we don't get along anymore. I heard the Iron Curtain speech. I see what you're doing in Greece, Mr. Truman. We're not friends. So why should I let you have a free city in the middle of a communist country? And he blocks it off. No. No way. I would have asked you if you were playing this game. Would you let him? Would you let him keep Berlin? Now, a lot of you have heard of the Berlin Airlift. You know of plane after 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 plane flying across communist airspace, over 200,000 flights for over a year, that they bring 1.5 million tons of supplies. I know you've probably heard about this. How we saved the free people of Berlin. But I want you to think about it. In 1948, remember what I said? Berlin is where they planned the Holocaust. Hitler's bunker is somewhere in there. And we're going to save these people? Why don't we just let the communists take it? Why do we care so much? Why are we risking World War III? I mean, think about it. If at any moment Stalin had given the order to shoot down one of these planes, that's an act of war. Americans have just died. Before you know it, it is World War III. The tanks on the border cross. And millions upon millions, even more than World War II, in the hundreds of millions, now die for that city where they planned, well, let's be blunt, World War I and II. Why would we do all of this? Well, just ask Kennedy. Let them come to Berlin. You see, again, it's all about ideology. It goes back to these people who are watching. These people who are watching what's going on. Hey, who's more powerful, the communists or the capitalists? What's better, freedom or communism? Well, I mean, this is pretty damn impressive if you're watching. Wow, look at that. There's a free city living surrounded by communists, and the free people won't let them go. The free people are supplying them. Wow, they're risking World War III in order to protect freedom. Wow, those people are pretty amazing. So it worked. It worked. It was, to be blunt, a hell of a risk. World War III. But it worked. Stalin said, all right, fine. Don't worry, we're not done with Berlin. It'll keep coming back. But I think you all should realize now what a symbol Berlin is. I mean, those people are living inside the communist world. Wow, now that's bravery. They're not on the lines. They're living behind the lines. We look to them and admire them. It was called Operation Vittles, for those of you who wanted to take any kind of notice. Notice on Easter Sunday, there was a plane landing every single minute filled with supplies. And in that same time period, right afterwards, or near the tail end of the Berlin Airlift, we, of course, formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You see, this is why this is relevant now. Why should I be watching this slideshow if I'm not going to be tested on it? Because President Trump right now has questioned the very existence of NATO. And to be blunt, I think that's a healthy question. I don't know if I necessarily agree with whether we should get rid of it or not. But NATO was formed for the purpose of defending the planet from communism, specifically Stalin. Well, Stalin's gone now, and so is the Soviet Union, so should NATO exist today? But back then it was pretty obvious. Notice the difference. This is something that you all should realize, how different America is now. Before World War II, We had passed Neutrality Act after Neutrality Act after Neutrality Act. London was burning and we still were not involved. Now we are in a military alliance, and not just with England, but with everybody in blue, including even the Turks. The Turks. Keep that in mind. If Turkey's at war, so are we. That's the way NATO's supposed to work. If you know anything at all about this area of the planet, you know that Turkey and Russia, they don't get along very well. And of course, Stalin didn't waste much time forming his own version, the Warsaw Pact. Now, the Warsaw Pact is gone today, which is yet another reason you might wonder, why do we need to know if the Warsaw Pact is gone? Well, let's talk about what a Soviet satellite is. See, these countries here were nicknamed Soviet satellites, just like if a satellite is out in space, we still control it. It doesn't really have any freedom to do what it wants. It doesn't really have any freedom to do what it wants. Stalin says jump, the Poles, the Romanians, the Hungarians, they say how high. So it's kind of silly. It wasn't really a pact. It was puppet master Stalin and puppets on the strings. So let me shut the lights off of this one, because this is one of the most famous pictures in American history. Well, at least one of the most famous of the post-war world, right? Dewey defeats Truman, so why is he smiling so much? The Chicago Tribune's never going to live this down. Hey, guess what? This is as fake as news gets, because he didn't. But that's how close the election was. That's how difficult this time period was, is that Truman, you know, the successor to Roosevelt, who had been elected for 4 terms, everybody expected him to lose, so much so that the Chicago Tribune accidentally printed it ahead of time thinking he did. He didn't lose. Truman won. And just in time for... Are you all aware that China is still communist? Now, yes, I know. I like to say that China is the most communist capitalist country on the planet. It's an fascinating country, a country that can be more capitalist than us in some ways, and yet more communist than anybody else in others. I don't really have time to explain this. Maybe in another story I can tell you all about what that actually means. But of course, it went communist under Mao Zedong, or Mao Zedong. How do you spell his name? Look at the original Chinese, okay? Obviously not like that. And I don't really have time to get into all the details as to why Chiang Kai-shek fled, why he lost to the communists. But you should be aware that this issue of fleeing to Taiwan is a big, big, big issue today. Today, China still does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. The Taiwanese, who were basically, what's the word, not absorbed, the Taiwanese all of a sudden were overwhelmed with Chinese refugees under Chiang Kai-shek, who went to Taiwan and declared themselves to still be China. They refused to recognize Mao and said, no, 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 I'm still China, I'm still China. Of course, Stalin could not be more happy. Realize how bad things are by 1950. The largest country on the planet, if you add their satellites, 15 time zones. The Soviet Union and its satellites is communist. 1 out of every 4 people is Chinese. The 2 ways to measure the size of a country, how big it is physically and how many people, and both of those have turned communist. America was freaking out in 1939 and 50. How did you, Truman, lose China? How'd you lose China? This issue of Taiwan is going to keep coming back. Again, even to this very day, Taiwan and China don't recognize each other's rights, for lack of a better word. So I would have asked you what you would have done about it. Now I want to let you know that in pretty much every time you ever play this game, that this is the most critical time. This is when the most war happens. This is when Americans feel so overwhelmed and so at a loss that some students have chosen to go to war, some students have chosen to not do anything and get thrown out of office in disgrace. This was a huge deal when China went communist. Very quickly, I feel responsible to tell you the reason why, very quickly, why Mao won was because he did such a good job fighting against the Japanese that once World War II was over, he was able to use all of that training, all of that knowledge, all of those resources to defeat Chiang Kai-shek. That's basically how that happened. So we move on. And this created one of the strangest moments in world history. You see, remember again that Chiang Kai-shek had fled to Taiwan, that he had said, I'm still China. I'm still leading China. And the United States, France, the other democracies said, yes, you're right. We don't recognize Mao as the leader of China. And in some ways, unfortunately, it kind of makes you realize just how sad that moment was. That was the only thing we could do was say, no, you didn't win. We're not going to recognize you. So something interesting happened in the United Nations. Stalin says to us, hey, you won't recognize my friend Mao? He's the leader of China now. If you're not going to recognize him, you're not going to recognize me. And the two of them, arm in arm, we're not going to participate in the UN anymore. Wait, we're just not going to participate. Keep that in mind for what's going to happen next, or in a little while. That the Soviet Union and Communist China are not participating in the United Nations in 1950. And then everything changes. You all know that the Soviets are going to get the bomb. You all know this. But what you have to understand, if you're about to understand one of the worst times to live inside America, a time of fear and hatred, of you're either with me or against me in America, if you're going to understand that, you have to understand that the Soviets weren't supposed to get the bomb, according to all scientists, until at least 1955 or 1960. It would take them a long time to figure out how to do it because the United States had kept the secret. You know, because that plan earlier had failed that I told you about. Stalin didn't take us up on it. And then all of a sudden in 1949, the Soviets announced to the world, we've got the bomb. We've got the bomb. What do we say? How did you get it so fast? We were freaking out. Now, of course, that means we could have a nuclear war. Now, if we fight the Soviets, it's nuclear. Heaven help us if that happens. And so, as Americans said, how did they get the bomb? As the spies here and spies there and spies here and spies there. Congress set up a committee of un-American activities to weed out communist spies, to find who these communist spies were. You all know what I'm getting at. Red Scare number 2, but better known as the McCarthy era. So I would have asked you, what are you going to do? Are you going to go to war right now? Get them before they can build more bombs? Are you going to set up a committee of un-American activities? And what does that mean? You know, if you don't like Bugs Bunny and apple pie, you don't like baseball, is that un-American? What exactly will that committee do? We'll talk about that too. And would you decide, well, since they got the atomic bomb, we're going to make an even bigger bomb. We're going to make the hydrogen bomb. Would you have done all that? Would have been asking you that. In this particular scenario, it is the most common one for students to get thrown out of office and disgraced. The odds are just so high because how do you please the American people? You have Americans saying, oh my God, there are communists everywhere. Total panic. Kind of the way some people are panicking today with the virus. And then you have other Americans saying, we can't lose what it means to be an American. You have the right to believe what you want to believe, to say what you want to say, Bill of Rights, etc., etc. So we were against ourselves. in so many ways. And was there a right decision? Of course not. How do you protect your freedoms and fight a war at the same time? Keep that in mind. For today, for the future. So very, very often we've rolled the dice, and students have been thrown out of office in disgrace, sometimes multiple times. Would that have happened to you? See, here's the problem. There were spies. Meet public enemy number one. The man who gave the Soviets the secret to the atomic bomb. David Greenglass. This is his sister, Ethel Rosenberg. Now, what basically happened was David had a job working on the atomic bomb project. He wasn't anybody important, but he was able to get his hands on stuff like this, an actual drawing of the lens mold for the bomb. David's sister, again, was Ethel. This is her husband, Julius Rosenberg. The story was basically that David had given his sister Ethel this information. Ethel had taken it to Julius. Julius had a contact in the embassy. Ethel typed up the notes. And that's how the Soviets got the bomb. That's the story. Now, as you can tell from these headlines, this was pretty controversial. Some people accused the government of being anti-Jewish. Anti-Jewish. I want to remind you that these two people who are Jewish, in 1949, that's only 4 years after the Holocaust. And some of you may be asking right away, well, why would you ever give the Soviets the secret to the atomic bomb? Because if you were Jewish and you heard what was happening in Russia during World War II, how Hitler was massacring Jews by the millions. I remind you what happened outside of Kiev and Babi Yar. That you wanted to help them. That was the Rosenbergs' motivation. But was it Ethel's motivation? I mean, Julius, well, we know some things about him. And we know some things about Ethel, but do we know everything? Slight detour for a second. When I was in college, kind of show you what college was like, I had to read these two books in a 2-week time period. That's what college is like. It was a Conspiracy in America course. I read, take a look at the books, how thick they are, this entire book. I read this entire book, the Rosenberg File. This one was actually written by their sons. Yes, these two people who died in the electric chair, the very, very first, and I think only, husband and wife to be executed by the United States government for treason. They had kids. I read this one in full. I read this one in full. I knew more about the Rosenbergs than I had ever learned, than I ever thought possible. And when I was done with both of these books, I was completely and totally convinced that I had no idea. It was one of the biggest secrets in American history for decades. Were they really guilty, or were they scapegoats? Jewish scapegoats who were set up by the government just to make the American people feel better. Is that what really happened to the Rosenbergs? About 15 years ago, David Greenglass, who is still alive, although he may have passed the last couple of years, I have not stayed a step on that. David Greenglass, in prison. The reason he's still alive, of course, is because he testified at his trial against his own sister. He turned state's evidence, as they say. He said, yeah. My sister typed up the notes, and Julius brought them to the embassy. He testified to that. Decades later, Julius, Ethel, are long dead. The kids are adults and on their own now. David gets interviewed by, I think it was CBS News, although don't hold me to that, in prison. David, it's been decades now. Let's talk a little bit about it. Mr. Greenglass, you turned state's evidence, saying your sister was the one who typed up the notes and gave them to her husband, Julius. You still hold to that? David looked into the camera and shockingly admitted, "Now, my sister was innocent." Let that sink in for a second. His sister was innocent. He claimed she was guilty. It was his words that sent his own sister to death, to the electric chair. Why in God's name would you say she did it? When she did it, why would you send your own sister to the electric chair? Because it was my wife who did it. He sent his own sister to the electric chair in order to save his wife. And that is what the McCarthy era was like. What will this mean next? Where will we go from here? What will J. Edgar Hoover do? How will he abuse power? What role will Ronald Reagan play as they put Hollywood on trial? We'll talk about all of this. Who got blacklisted like Orson Welles? What the Korean War has to do with all of this. Once you consider the most important question of all, how do you win a nuclear war? Before we can go any further, before we can talk about the war in Korea, MacArthur and his role, think about that. How do you win a nuclear war? If you were president of the United States and you said to your generals, I want a strategy for winning this war. If we have to fight Russia, if it's World War III, I want to know how we're going to win it. And your generals turn to you and say, sir, could you please define winning? How many people have to die? What's acceptable losses in a nuclear war? Think about that. And we'll address that issue next time. Thank you.